go. So Cecilia, welcome. How are you doing in Chicago?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here with you, Michael, and to be in sunshine. You'll see a little bit of the sun reflecting. I'm doing very well because we've had some good weather. Spring is springing, I hope.
Excellent. So Cecilia, you've seen enough of these that you know we like to start by asking our guests, how did you get to this point in your asset management journey?
Well, it's interesting because I have been a consultant for many years, but I started my career off as a corporate person. And I was involved in asset management on the real estate side, real property, both for Ameritech and McDonald, so in the big corporate world. And then I started doing my own thing in terms of consulting. And you will recall that you and I worked together when you were doing BIM, building information modeling and management work, and I got involved with you working on that. And then when you started working with the ALN, with Asset Leadership Network, I kept saying to myself, well, how come Michael is working on asset management and I haven't done anything with that? I should. I kept in the back of my mind. You kept having all this excitement going on with ALN. And I said, I should really check into it. And so last year, when I decided to jump in with both feet, I went for the professional certification that ALN offers. And boy, the rest is history because it just spoke to me so much.
Well, that's great. Yeah, Cecilia and I are colleagues for a long time, and it's great to be working with somebody who you're also friends with. Yeah, just like last week, Jim Dieter said he'd been longtime friends with Bill Franklin, and so Cecilia and I are longtime friends. So Cecilia, what did you think of the training?
I really enjoyed the training because, you know, the average person thinks of asset management a couple of different ways, whether it's asset management of money, financial asset management, or asset management of equipment. And this work that we do with ISO 55000 blows that away, and it goes to what I love to do. It looks at the diversity of what assets are and what we define assets to be. And so ISO 55000 starts with that very simple definition that the asset is something that the company values, that it values it towards its mission. Now, I know I didn't
it provides value to the mission.
It provides the value to the company. I did pass the class and I did get the certification. I got the question right on the test. But
so you're under pressure.
You know, I always modify my definitions, but the point is, it's looking at what provides value to the organization, and the only values that organizations care about are those things that allow them to achieve their mission, right?
And so, you have always been involved in organizations that have very high ideal missions. So that's one of the reasons why I like working with you. And so you like the training. And then also this week in our newsletter was a little different, where our guest actually requested us to highlight somebody. And you asked us to highlight Julianne Richardson. Can you tell us why you wanted that?
Yes, because Julianne Richardson is, for me, she's a shero for me. She is a contemporary, also an attorney like me.
From Chicago.
From Chicago. But she started out with having her own little show at one point. You know, she worked as a lawyer, but she started out with a show. And I remember when she came up with this idea that she was going to start the History Makers, which was going to be an archive of Black history makers, because you need to be able to know the stories of people to understand their culture and who they are and their place in society. And she had this idea, a little kernel back in, I don't remember, it was early 90 or it might have been even before. And she started this, and now the History Makers has gone so far as to be in the Smithsonian, archived in the Congress.
Thousands of interviews.
Thousands of interviews. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this, not just because it's history makers and it's Black history makers, but we were going to look at it's Women's Month, Women's History Month, and a woman who looked at history like Julianne Richardson did and said, let me look at what is important to uphold. And it's not just the greatest people that she put out there. She's put out individuals that are the average Joes as well as those stars that you would know, people who've made history in their own way. And the importance of that and the tie back to what we're talking about with asset management is that asset management as well as history is about stories, and asset management is about the stories that we need to know about the things that we have that are of value for the mission of the organization, and the stakeholders stories that are ingrained into the ISO 55000 standard.
I liked it. I like that you requested it because what she did was take the intangible asset of stories from an underrepresented stakeholder group of the United States and added value to those stories by archiving them. And then that gives a foundation for creating value for underrepresented people going forward in the continuing experiment of democracy in the United States.
Boy, so much better said.
You're under pressure because you're the guest. I really love that you did that. So thank you for that. But you're kind of a history maker too, especially in the ALN, because you've been involved in starting the ALN Español, and you've been involved in starting the ALN Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership Group. And so can we talk about those one at a time? Let's first talk about the equity one, because that kind of ties in with Juliana Richardson. And tell us about your involvement with advanced equity with asset leadership.
Okay, let's talk about that, and let's break it down a little bit. One of the things with ISO 55000 and the standard itself going through 55001 is the various portions of the standard mention stakeholders. And one of the things that I care about is creating a table, setting a table and inviting everyone to join the meal. So you've got to create a recipe that everyone will enjoy and invite them to the table. You've got to make sure you know who your stakeholders are. ISO 55000 does that. And when we were looking at the whole issue of dealing, and this is really Jim Dieter who said we ought to be thinking about this a little bit more. And I think everybody has been, with the whole George Floyd situation, with the pandemic, and looking at all the social determinants that cause problems in various communities, such that we end up having higher rates of death and higher rates of infection in Black and Brown communities. All of those things are related to how do we deal with the stakeholders and how do we remember stakeholders and
involve them, not just remember them.
Well, but you have to remember them first to be able to involve them. See, the problem is everybody goes for the usual suspects, and we are all guilty of doing that in everything that we do in life, whether it's having a party, whether it's work. I don't care what it is, you think of who you normally would think of to invite to your party and to invite to the table. If you don't stop and force yourself to stop and think who's missing from the table, you take a chance and a risk of not doing the best event that you want to do, the best program or project, because you're not getting all the right inputs. Yes. So that is the rationale when I say understanding other people's stories, understanding that they're out there. So you have to remember that they're there, and then you have to invite them. And that's one of the things that I love about ISO 55000 is that it formalizes that process of stakeholder involvement. So, you have to first understand the company's mission, but sometimes you should start with who are the stakeholders of the company to get to the mission. I know we said that in what we looked at. And you then need to look at really establishing what are the requirements and expectations for your organizations, for the stakeholders. What are their requirements? What are your requirements for what you might need from them? What are the expectations of stakeholders for what you might be offering to them? Then you have to understand where is, and establish also what are the decision-making points that you need to have stakeholder involvement for. What are the, what kind of information sharing should you do with stakeholders? You know, we talk about the company or organization's policies. The policies need to be communicated. They need to contemplate stakeholders and then be communicated to stakeholders and available to stakeholders. And you just have to make sure to think about stakeholders at all points during your journey. And that is what I love about ISO 55000.
We have many people who are new to this program and to ALN. So I want to just take a moment to say that what this ISO document is a structure that is broken into segments, and there's shall statements for all of them. And there are many shall statements. And one of them is you shall involve all relevant stakeholders. And what I liked about the Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership Committee that you helped form was that the committee understood that by following that shall statement, government organizations, either federal, state, or local governments, are then required to be empathetic and involving of all people. It kind of like is a structured regulation to be nice and inclusive with everyone.
That's right.
It's a real interesting bridge, and the committee understood that and has written a document if people are interested, because there are some comments, Cecilia, coming up that are saying that they're liking your point. You can contact us and we'll get you more information on that. So this is really fast, so I want to move along. You also speak beautiful Spanish, and you helped establish the ALN Español group. And can you tell us a little bit about that group?
Well, first of all, for those of you who might not know what ISO is, it's International Standards Organization. And the ISO standards, there are many of them. And when you see that ours is 55,000 that we're talking about right now, you can imagine there are many. These standards are translated in other languages oftentimes, but the international language of ISO is English. But what we thought about is if we're going to be inclusive, there are people who, while they may know the standard through the English version, and it is translated in Spanish, French, and other languages, they don't work with it on a daily basis in English. They work in their native tongue. And so we thought, why not have ALN Español and give that as a networking chance, just like we have ALN Thursdays at 4, to have a chance for those who are in Latin America, Spain, wherever, in the US, it doesn't matter where you are, who are operating in Spanish language, to have a chance to do so in their own tongue. And so we're doing that on a quarterly basis, more or less. And so that's been fun.
The first program was on the new ALN Español A55K training. So the training that Cecilia received a certification in is now available in Spanish. So we're talking about the benefits of that. And then the next program will be on the benefits of organizational certification to ISO. And so thank you for helping us stand up that. We think that's going to be very important in
thank you.
Our future and for the future of organizations around the world.
I think it is really good because even in our inaugural one, we did risk mitigation, if you recall, in the very inaugural one.
The 2020 forum, right? Yeah.
The 2020 forum, we did an inaugural one that was on risk mitigation in Spanish. And that was very interesting. And you see, it makes a difference because these standards are being applied internationally, and we can also then begin to influence them with the whole question of equity and stakeholder involvement, which we really want people to be thinking about. And as you mentioned, what we have been doing with the committee, one of the things that I'm really thrilled about is what the Biden administration has been doing with some of their executive orders. All of the equity that they have thrown out as far as—
No. They haven't thrown out equity.
No, they have uplifted. They have uplifted equity as they have heralded equity.
Yes.
They have truly heralded equity as a true cultural value of the US of A. And for those of you who are listening, who sometimes feel like, wait a minute, you are worrying about all the Black and brown people, what about me? Which is a normal thing for people to do. It is normal to worry about yourself. Equity does not mean exclusion, it means inclusion. It means making things fair, being open, keeping an eye, keeping an ear, keeping a heart open to making sure that everything is equitable, that we are doing things such that our service delivery is looking at who needs to be affected, who is being affected, who needs to be benefited by this. How do we best benefit them? It's not just always about the cost of things, it's about making sure you have quality and the right things to be done. And it's interesting when we think about stories. I'm going to take it back to the story issue of our stakeholders. Right now, we heard about Dallas and what happened in Texas and the horrible winter storm that took out the power and the water issues that they were having in Texas. Mike, do you remember hearing much about Mississippi?
Just a little.
Do you realize that in Jackson, Mississippi, they still don't have water? They're not with potable water. 3 weeks later. So the stories we tell and the stakeholders that we uplift in terms of giving people awareness, consciousness awareness, those things are very critical. It is critical for us to expand our minds and often think about the unusual suspect, not the usual suspect. The news media needs to work harder on this as well, because they tell one story and everybody then tells the same story. It needs to be expanded to make sure who's not being included.
So let's go off of this, who are the unusual suspects, because we've been talking about your ALN activities and everything. We haven't even gotten to you and your company yet. So in the newsletter, I included a link to one of your presentations, and the title of it is The Unusual Suspects. Can you tell us how that fits into the way Strategy Insight approaches your business activities, and maybe tell us a little bit about your business activities?
Well, how I approach my business activities is, look, any project that I'm on, I'm going to go in and I do what I like to call sometimes SpongeBob it. You know, you're doing the menu planning. You're saying to your host, what is it that you want to serve? What is your goal? We want to figure that out. Then you go in and then you SpongeBob and you see what's there. What are the ingredients that they're working with now? Who's there? Who's not there? And you share that with them and confirm with them what they think that they know and what you happen to have seen that they might not have seen. And, you know, some of my background is in corporate strategy. And so I'm always looking at competitive advantage. So once I've gone in and SpongeBobbed my company or my clients, I'm going to then look at what are the people that they have as competitors doing? And I'm going to look at, is there something different in another avenue? Are they working with other people that we ought to be working with? you look for things that you don't see present. Because oftentimes people think that they have all the pieces of the puzzle there and it makes one picture. But if you add a few more pieces, you get a different picture completely. So
Yes.
that's one of the things that I tend to do. And I will do that a number of ways. You're going to look at the users of a product. You're going to look to the service providers that work with a company and ask them what other connections they have to the issue that you're dealing with for the particular client. And, you're just going to ask the client questions. Sometimes a simple question is all you need to gain insight.
So speaking of questions, I had forgotten to tell people that they can post questions and chat by clicking on their bar, their toolbar, I guess it's called, I forget. And sometimes you have to scroll around to make it pop up. And we have questions actually that came in even before the program started, because as soon as it was known that you were going to be speaking, we had people, Helene Shore in particular, was asked how can, she's on a county board and they want to be more diverse and inclusive, and they're having a hard time reaching out to their constituents. And I earnestly agreed to talk with her this weekend, but if you can, share a few comments, what kind of things will you be telling Helene this weekend about more inclusiveness?
Well, the first thing is when you've got a situation, especially municipalities often have this, there are, again, the usual suspects of all the places you can go, but then there's some of the places that you never think about going. So sometimes I will tell organizations, economic development organizations, have they stopped to look at the folks that are doing social services in their communities? Have they looked at their education institutions, their universities, their community colleges? Have they looked into the arts consortiums?
Ooh.
There are so many places, even so much as to say, have they gone to the people who are working with the police? Sometimes the people that are in the community that work with the beats cops, the CAPS programs,
Yes.
they care enough about their community to be there working with CAPS. So maybe if you want somebody who has passion and insight because they know the community, you go to those folks and you talk to the chief of police and say, let me talk to your CAPS coordinator, who's been involved, who's been there. Those are some of the kinds of things, looking at not just the companies, but you always go back to your clients, your existing clients. So your existing companies are very critical to talk to. All your existing customers or companies that are in your community, those are the people you're going to go to and ask them, because they may have some insights for you.
Okay.
And I did mention the faith-based organizations because that's an automatic go-to. If you don't go to faith-based organizations, you're missing out on the boat, because first of all, they're developing the communities themselves. They have the players. They know who also will step up to the plate and participate.
Before we go on to the next question, a clarifying question.
Oh.
CAPS.
I think community action policing,
System.
system. Oh, you got me. That's a bad one. I hate acronyms. So that's not an inclusive thing, by the way, to use acronyms. And I
Yes.
tend to, but I will describe it as the organization that works with the police in communities, that is made up of the constituents or the community members.
In
Keep their
Chicago,
eyes
it's
out.
called, in Chicago, it's called CAPS, but in other places, it's just the community stakeholders. All right. Can you very quickly answer a question from Stephanie? Is it Emmerich or Emrich?
Emrich.
Emrich.
What is her question?
Her question is, what is the takeaway from today's conversation?
I would say that the key takeaway is always to ask the question, who is not at the table? Who's not at the table within your own organization internally? Look internally first. Who are you missing internally? Because this diversity is not just black and brown and yellow, white. It is functional, it's geographic, it's cultural of all levels. So who's not at the table internally? What is not being done? What is not at the table as well? And then what would our customers externally, our stakeholders and our customers care about that we need to reach out to them and ask them first off? Asking questions, that's the next takeaway. You must ask questions because asking questions always yields insight. So thank you for that question, Stephanie. Hopefully that's a good enough takeaway in terms of thinking about it. And the other thing I want to say, one last thing I want to.
Can you say it in overtime? Because it's a 30-minute program. We want to thank our sponsors. Let everybody know that we will go into overtime to finish that thought. And then I also want to say that next week, Doug Getz will be speaking, and Doug Getz is an internationally known property management expert. That's going to be an excellent presentation also. So we look forward to that. All right. So for those of you who want to stick around, we'll go into overtime and continue this discussion.
So the other thought that I was about to say, and it was something that came to me as I was thinking about this whole question of diversity and looking at stakeholders in asset management, because one of the things with ISO 55000 is the communication with the internal and external stakeholders. I also think of it as the relationships with those people to make sure they understand what the mission of the organization is and how it ties into what they do and what the asset they are trying to manage, what that has to do with achieving the mission of the organization. So making sure that they understand their relationship overall and have the tools and resources to do what they need to do is critical. And then the other thing is, I want us to think about teams a little differently in those relationships, knowing their stories, knowing the stories of the people that are involved, whether it's stakeholders internally or externally, will make a difference. And when they say that there's no I in team, I have decided that I'm going to be, as usual, controversial and say there's definitely an I in team, because every team is made up of individuals, and individuals have stories. Individuals are the relationships that we need to bring together to manage our assets, to manage our business, and to move it forward. So thank you for that.
There is no I in team, but there is an M and a me, an M and an E, and that stands for me.
Okay, well, I'll let you do that one. I was going to say that there's an I that gets topped with the T, with the top of the T. The I's are what makes the team have a platform to move forward.
Yes.
So that's what I was going to say, but I forgot that one with the ME. There's a me, and we're all included when we're on teams. So I like that.
Excellent.
Any other questions that we didn't catch?
Oh, yeah. So let me. It's kind of I'm juggling how to organize them in my mind. So one of the questions is coming from Marty Rowland. Marty is one of your colleagues on the Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership team, and he had called me this morning and asked if we could do a special program for Jackson, Mississippi. And so I'm asking you, for Marty, who chimed in earlier, what kind of activities do you think we might be able to bring to Jackson, Mississippi?
That's a good question. I'm going to put my thinking cap on that because right now there is a huge need. I know this sounds silly, but well, it's not silly. In my prayer group, we have been praying for Jackson, Mississippi every day. And one of the prayer groups that I'm in specifically the organization, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, is gathering funds to help with the reliefs that needs to be done for Jackson, Mississippi, where folks are suffering from the lack of water, lack of food, because things have not been resolved, just like Flint has not been resolved in all these years. It's a terrible thing that we can have the question and issue be raised and held up for us that we need to solve it, and we don't get it solved very quickly. I'm getting the afternoon sun, and so I apologize for that. I'm going to try and put myself not in the spotlight.
You are glowing, Cecilia.
Yes, I'm glowing.
You look brilliant.
And I see another question from Cliff Colvin, which is a really good question, and this is one we grapple with. Once you get as many as possible to your table, how can you be sure to serve them appropriately so they keep coming back? Excellent question, Cliff. This one, first of all, like I said, to serve them appropriately, you've got to first do a little bit of understanding of their story before they get to the dinner table, and make sure that you don't serve them something like cilantro that they don't like, or something that they're allergic to, and you make sure you serve them something that they can handle.
Cecilia is allergic to cilantro.
Then you give them the understanding that you have heard what they brought to the table, and you then memorialize it once they're no longer at the table, so that it becomes part of the fabric of who you are, and you give them information that lets them know that you did do that. Because what you're trying to do is convert those people that you bring to the table as your ambassadors, whether it's your ambassador to help you sell whatever it is you're selling, whether it's to build whatever you're trying to build. People want to be included, and inclusion is key. So that's one of the ways.
Well, one of our other organizational members, John, is saying that flooded cities, cities that are having problems, could benefit from identity tags. And that's basic asset management 101. I've got one of John's identity tags right here on my computer, and if it floated away and somebody found it, that would be able to come back to me. So that's a tactical thing.
That's an excellent idea.
And Jim Dieter basically asked this question years ago. He says there's 3 circles. There's strategy, tactics, and operations, and they overlap. And with a company name, Strategies Insight, how do you see strategies informed by ISO 55000 affecting the tactics and operations at a planning level for Jackson, Mississippi? Maybe it's not something that they can do this week. This week, we need to get them food and water and things like that. Next week or next month, how do their leaders start strategizing to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. What they need to do is they have to get out of the mode of being underwater, literally, and then come up for air. And when they come up for air, what they need to do is look at what happened. Where did we go wrong? Was there something that we missed? You've got to go backwards, Sankofa, to see where you've been to go forward.
Kofa?
Sankofa, the African saying, there's this African bird that looks backwards.
Okay.
Anyway, Sankofa. Oh, saying stuff that people don't know. But they will have to go and look at what happened that caused this. Just like we knew in Texas that they didn't do the mitigation that they could have done, and now they will have to do that. They have to identify where was the missing gap that we had. And then you've got to build back better, like Biden says.
Excellent.
But you've got to make sure that you're doing it in all communities that have been affected. And you have to look closely at why they were affected. What were the disparities? What was the disparity in the delivery before that caused that? How do we avoid that planning mishap? It's a strategic thing to think about it at the beginning but it's also an operational and tactical thing to involve those stakeholders right away to say, what happened when your water came in? Did you notice? Interviewing people. And it takes time and bodies to do some of that work. But the intent has to be there, and then the execution has to be there as well, if that makes sense.
Another question that was pre-asked basically from one of our guests, Christina Farnsworth, who taught me that she ended her interviews with, "What haven't I asked you that you thought I was going to ask?"
Oh, wow. That's an interesting one. You've asked a lot of questions, so I don't know that you missed anything. I mean, I could go on about some of this subject and the whole issue of learning other people's stories, more, and then making sure that you share those stories and use them as ways to understand the people you're dealing with, and share your story as well so that you could be understood, and always take things as not necessarily personal in terms of what somebody does. Trust somebody's motives when they tell you something. Listen more, talk less. My brothers would love to hear me say that, and they'd love to see me do it too.
All right. So what is your vision for future involving assets and asset leadership, from Jim Dieter? That's a very good one. Thanks, Jim.
Well, Jim, I think that the future for ALN really is in what ALN is about, which is leadership. And I used to call the diversity training that I would do total leadership, diversity, total leadership, TLD, total leadership diversity, which meant it's not just the head of the organization that's a leader. It's everybody in the organization. And ISO 55000 really embodies that, and I think embraces that. And where you have taken us, Jim, in looking at equity, where it's a little bit of a different definition in terms of equity is making sure it's equal, but also equality and pulling in everybody's talents and letting everybody be a leader regarding the assets that they must manage, and the mission that is the organization's mission belongs to each and every individual in that organization. And then that organization then has to send that mission out and send it out through their external stakeholders as ambassadors, that they will then share that mission as well. I think that ALN is doing a really good job of beginning that process of sharing its mission for asset leadership to be throughout an organization, and making sure that different kinds of organizations look at utilizing this. Aside from the government, because governments have so many assets to deal with, we're talking about it can be used by not-for-profits, it can be used by community, it can be used even in your own family to organize yourself. So I would say that the future is very bright for ALN, and just following what we are doing with more stakeholder involvement, highlighting the formalization of that, so that when organizations that are using ISO 55000 are using that standard, they utilize it to make sure they bring equity to the forefront. And I think that that is something that can happen with the executive orders that the Biden administration has put out there. There is a culture change and a shift. And it's not just at the governmental level, society is shifting as well. With what we saw with the pandemic, with what we saw with George Floyd, people are beginning to realize that we have had too many disconnects, the disconnects politically, the disconnects socially. People want to see more harmony. And I think that having an organization like ALN that is focusing on leadership and managing assets of all kinds, it's very critical. And I think it's very opportune right now to spread this word and this kind of a practice, to give a simple way of looking at managing your assets in a coordinated fashion where you value everything, you look towards risk mitigation, you include your stakeholders, you share your information. It is simplicity can be very beautiful sometimes. And ALN, in taking up the banner of ISO 55000 and ISO 55001, I think we are doing an excellent job in simplifying, but making something that is supposed to be common sense, commonplace, and letting it be embraced by others.
Ooh, good. And
Enough answer,
that's
Jim?
that's a very good ending. And thank you for drawing that out. And thank you for drawing out our largest Thursday at 4 audience by almost 75% more than ever before, Cecilia.
Oh,
People
wow.
interested in what you have to say. So thank you for sharing this. Thank you all for attending and for sticking around. And this will be available on podcast and video recording on our website. So
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to join you, and for your commitment to ALN that I got to watch on the sidelines and now get to be part of. And
oh, you're in the middle of it now.
in the midst of it, but I am enjoying what I'm learning, and I love that it aligns with my own mission. So it's perfect.
Excellent. Thank you.
Have a great
Bye,
night.
everybody.
Bye-bye.